February 1992. Doctor Who had been off the air for more than 2 years. The first series of original novels, Time Worm, had come to an end and met with broadly decent reviews despite some controversies. Despite the overarching title, those 4 books were only loosely linked. So when a second series, Cat's Cradle, was announced for the first half of 92, fans keenly anticipated the story. After a slightly false start, would this second series be more consistent, with a stronger overarching theme? Would they feel less like a bunch of completely unrelated stories awkwardly jammed together with a single title? No. This is the Library of St John the Beheaded, and today we are looking at the first of the Cat's Cradle novels, Time's Crucible by Marc Platt. It's been a very long time since this series was last on. I'm sorry about the delay. There's been 101 massive things going on in my life over the past 6 or so months, but the series is very much back now and hopefully carrying on at a reasonable speed again. Hell, I might even be able to get 1 a week done. Actually no, don't be ridiculous. Anyway, here we are, Cat's Cradle, Time's Crucible. Platt was the second Virgin New Adventures author to have also written for the TV show, having penned the last story ever filmed, Season 26's Ghostlight. That story had begun life as something very different, a deeper tale diving into the history of Gallifrey entitled Lungbarrow. This had not been entirely warmly received by the show's production team. John Nathan Turner did not think it was particularly appropriate, but the overall atmosphere of the story was popular and ended up being adapted into the similarly spooky Ghostlight. Lungbarrow, of course, will go on to be the final 7th Doctor novel. In the same way, Time's Crucible had begun life as the first script Platt had submitted to the BBC several years earlier, at that time not featuring the Gallifreyan lore that makes up a significant part of the novel. It also was considered unsuitable, which will be of no surprise to anyone who's read the book. It was with the arrival of the original novel line that Platt brought together these 2 unused stories, taking the bulk of Time's Crucible, then called Cat's Cradle, and at one point also featuring the working title Old Haunts, and throwing in a prequel to Lungbarrow. The Cartmel master plan was back on the table again. Peter Darville Evans grasped on a couple of themes of the story, a broken TARDIS and a mysterious silver cat, and suggested them as the focus of the next trilogy. This was all before the Time Worm books had been published, of course, and thus before the realisation that actually linking only loosely connected stories with a title and a theme forced upon the authors wouldn't really work. Platt's title of Cat's Cradle became the trilogy's title, and the book was renamed Time's Crucible. Evans encouraged the authors to meet and discuss their books, although there is very little evidence of this in the works themselves. Platt submitted the final manuscript in 91 and art was commissioned. At this point, there was a conscious decision made to move towards more narrative images from the stories and away from the collage style of the earlier Target books range. Artists from the Sarah Brown agency were hired. Time's Crucible was the start of a relationship with artist Peter Elson, whose science fiction elements were considered excellent. Interestingly, after release, the book was also translated into Hungarian, not something that happened with other Virgin New Adventures. And so to the book itself. This is a long, complicated and important one, so there's quite a bit to say. Let's start at the beginning. The book's prologue is fairly short and seemingly inconsequential, though it sets up a lot of the book itself. The Doctor considering Gallifrey's dark times and a small change in a mechanical sound in the TARDIS. And then we dive headfirst into lore. For something entitled Moussaka and Chips, Chapter 1 is very fantasy-based, looking deep into the history of Gallifrey to those dark times, an era where young heroes, capitalised of course, study philosophy and strategy from sandal-wearing tutors before heading out into the Empire to have bold, exciting adventures. They're trained in sports and swordplay. Fantasy is something rarely seen in classic Who. There are of course plenty of times when mythical creatures turn out to have had extraterrestrial origins, but these swords and sorcery imagery portrayed in the opening Gallifrey scenes of Time's Crucible are something else entirely. It's very fitting with the idea of the VNAs moving into brave new territory, but as someone who loathes low fantasy, it's not necessarily the most welcome move for me. Still, it's absolutely awash with Gallifreyan lore. We learn that the latent telepathic skills occasionally seen from the Doctor and the Master were once Gallifrey's main manner of communication. Haclav Augusti Pridonius, for that was the full name of the hero the Doctor's Gallifreyan school was named after, has returned from defeating a Sphinx, something that will have more than a little resonance in a key book tying together several ranges of Doctor Who spin-off fiction at the very end of the 1990s. Yet beneath all this there is a battle going on between the fantasy world of ancient Gallifrey and the new world of time travel and science, being investigated by a certain Gallifreyan named Rassilon, and the Age of Reason that's threatening to break through. This is all relayed through the eyes of Vale, one who had been singled out as an individual, able to resist the telepathy of his people, able to see beyond their ignorance, one willing the end of superstition and hoping to see the Age of Reason arrive. And then he sees a vision, an elderly version of himself voyaging through distant stars. An object is heading his way. He knows it will hit him and crush him. It is a blue rectangular object with the words Police Public Call Box written on it. This is a very bold opening to a book, let's be honest. The question is it any good? This is probably the first example of the V&A's really leaning into proper spin-off territory. This is the last thing I'd ever want to see on screen. When was the last time we got really, really good Gallifreyan lore on TV? I can only think of 3 examples of genuinely great Time Lord stories in the history of the TV show. The War Games, which is a major game changer for the whole franchise, in which we meet the Doctor's people for the first time, discover that regeneration is a regular thing for them, learn about some of their rules and even see parts of Gallifrey, and yet it's still shrouded in mystery. Other than discovering that they're called Time Lords, we don't actually learn any specifics about them at all, and the Time Lords come away from it seeming powerful and mysterious. Then there's the Deadly Assassin, which invented the version of Gallifrey most well known, tedious, officious, pompous, pedantic. It was accused at the time, and still occasionally to this day, of demystifying the Time Lords too much. And yet, what it really does is explain why the Doctor was so desperate to leave. It shows a society that is stagnated, but only hints at what it once was and what it could be again if it allowed itself to be. And The End of Time, which builds on a number of concepts that came from the Wilderness Years, showing that the Time Lords could be villains, not the lone renegades who leave the planet, but Rassilon and High Council members. Other than those 3, other examples of Gallifrey appearing in the show are either as boring and tedious as living among them would be, or so filled with confusing, contentious lore that they become immediately reviled. Yes, Mr. Chibnall, I'm talking about you. And lest we forget, Doctor Who is an early evening family-friendly light entertainment TV show. This really is the last thing I'd want to see on the show itself. And yet, this is what spin-off media should do. It should explore the nooks and crannies, the depths of the show's universe that the comparative minority of nerdy fans would find fascinating. There are 2 Doctor Who's, the mainline version that is being broadcast as 40 series of television that I can put on when I want a fun space and time adventure, and the spin-off version which dives deep into frankly quite maddening lore when I'm in that sort of mood. Each of these should be able to live separately. In fact, they kind of need to survive. But when I'm in a Doctor Who nerd kind of mood, then this opening section works wonders. It's full of intrigue, it builds on what we already know about Gallifrey and both expands it and dismantles it, and at this point it asks more questions than it answers. More interesting are the early experiments in time travel, animals have their life sped up to a matter of minutes. Volunteers spend 90 days in isolation only to reappear 90 relative minutes after they entered. This all feels more traditionally science fiction and acts as a suitable counterpoint, the Pythia's mysticism versus Rassilon's rationalism. The biggest problem is that this is not the main focus of the book. I wouldn't necessarily want an entire novel of Marc Platt's ancient Gallifrey. It leans too heavily on cliches to feel like a properly developed society. It's a story I'd love to see maybe a bit more of. Sadly, what we get instead is a story that we see way too much of. Actually, the main story starts okay. The Doctor and Ace are having lunch in a cafe in London. Ace ponders the peculiarities of TARDIS travel, the Doctor's only outfit, the lack of jet lag, the daft names of artefacts they find. She's renamed the TARDIS food machine Captain Lunchbox, all pleasingly meta without being self-indulgent. things start to get weird. A black cat turns up and inexplicably sets Ace on edge. It's foreshadowing, although not in a way the reader might expect. It's followed by a silver cat spied outside the cafe. Then the sky turns orange, time slows down, the cafe's customer's skin goes grey, the Doctor keels over in pain and runs into the street. At first it seems the book will alternate between chapters about Vale, and in his second he uses his telepathy to burn an annoying associate to death, and the Doctor and Ace inevitably leading to a meeting of the two at the book's climax. Instead, chapter 2 goes straight to it. Chaos on Gallifrey seems to be occurring simultaneously with the madness in Ealing. Vale watches the sky tear apart while Ace confronts an apparition of her mother. There's some wonderful imagery in here, the sky becoming detached, the TARDIS door disappearing, the sound of scrabbling from within the ship. Something has invaded the Doctor's home. The door, wherever you stand, is always on the next side round. The TARDIS dimensional defence systems are being altered from the inside. It's called a tomorrow conundrum. When the door finally appears, it's because of a never-before-seen phone ringing from the alcove on the front, in a moment mirroring the Ninth Doctor's in The Empty Child. Back on Gallifrey, and we get a final glimpse of ancient history for now. The first team of Gallifreyans to travel in time, a group of chronauts using their thoughts to pilot a timescape. Perhaps in a reference to the number of sides on a TARDIS console, 6 Gallifreyan minds are required to pilot this timescape. Unsurprisingly, one of these is Vale, and unsurprisingly his confrontational attitude leads to disaster. What happens next is maybe not the biggest surprise. While the Doctor and Ace are trying to identify the slimy trails left by an enormous mollusk in the TARDIS, Vale mercilessly teases the child pilot of the timescape, sending it hurtling out of control towards the blue rectangular box he'd seen in his earlier vision. Time inverts, spewing and hurling its cogs, wheels, spindles and springs across space. Ace, plunging into oblivion, has one last thought, but disturbingly it is not her own. The Doctor is thinking, the process is only beginning. I've been threatening that the book goes into dullness, and this is where that starts. Until now, the Gallifreyan history is fascinating, if a little indulgent, while Ace and the Doctor's situation is brimming with sinister imagery and barely concealed dread, the pair realising they're locked in the TARDIS control room with an unidentified something scrabbling around in the walls is a scene I love to see replicated in the TV series. The first we see of this new inside-out reality is Ace sat at her school desk. It's familiar imagery from what we saw in the previous book, Time Worm Revelation, and slightly disappointing as a result. Given the timetable of submissions to the publisher, it's almost certainly a coincidence, but an unfortunate one that just leaves the book feeling rather unoriginal. But that's only a brief aside, because then all our characters emerge into the book's main setting. And you know it's going to be one of those stories when there's a sudden lurch to a setting with no explanation, just a parade of names like Shonzi, Amnoni, the Goik, the Urchin, the Phasal Work Gang, and Quenesander Oliesti Peccary, first son of the House of Forfarding. Marc Platt's writing in general tends towards the baroque and the oblique, creating intricate Gothic worlds that are often slightly less fun to explore than they probably were to create. We're quickly reintroduced to Vale at a moment which makes it clear who these characters are, the crew of the timescape. Who the guards and the Goik are, however, is mystery at this point. As is the location, a grey landscape in a world without colour, with the ruins of a city ruled over by a tyrannical figure called the Process. How much mystery is enough? How much is too much? Part of my issue with Time's Crucible is that Platt clearly doesn't know the answer to these questions. He loves to pile on mystery, and indeed the majority of the book is spent doing just that. There's a lot of potential in the world he builds up, a strange grey planet with different time zones that encase different periods in the world's history, separated by rivers of mercury, a place of forests filled with trees of smoke, ruled over by a giant worm called the Process, the population of the timescape enslaved by insect-headed guards, and struggling to fight between their natural superstitions and what remains of their memories of science. They're forced into manual labour, made to search for the future which has apparently been stolen by the Doctor. He finally turns up what feels like several thousand pages in, only he has no memory and calls himself Dr. Willoughby, i.e. he will be the Doctor. But despite the great setting, it's just that, a setting. Ace spends the bulk of the book exploring it, feeling mystified, and occasionally trying to help its occupants. And that isn't really a plot. When you're begging for something to properly happen, some drama, a twist, some example of narrative creativity, all we get is another layer of mystery or another encounter with the process. And as everything is resolved with one single explanation that rolls out over a period of time, it's arguable that at some point we don't need more mysteries. This world is the first Dyson sphere encountered in Doctor Who. Ace's realisation that instead of a horizon the ground actually bends upwards towards the sky is a brilliant one. She reacts with revulsion at something that feels so utterly against nature. The process itself makes a pretty good repulsive antagonist, moving around with a wheezed squelch hiss, an enormous worm-like creature with a mouth on each end, slopping about the planet, rolling its rear end up to its front to move and always facing forwards with one of its two faces, the others on each foot. It's deeply unpleasant, but it's hard to fully appreciate as a threat because its goals are so vague. At one point, two processes from different times in the city's history face off and argue, although what they say is broadly incomprehensible, just a jumble of sentences about the now, the future, the beginning, the disruption. There are other bits that bother me. The start of a few chapters leaps to present tense for a few paragraphs before switching back to past tense again. This kind of shift can sometimes work, but it has to be a clear stylistic decision and part of a greater theme. Something like Hilary Mantel's A Place of Greater Safety is an excellent example of it being done brilliantly. In a book set on a planet with clashing timelines, each set in a perpetual now, there is potential for some very interesting experimentation in this area, but just switching tense for a few paragraphs 2 or 3 times feels jarring and amateurish rather than interesting or thematic. To be fair, the moment you realise that time is measured in distance rather than, well, time in the city is a really good reveal. How long ago? Does she mean how far? The perpetual now is maintained by different time periods being split geographically, each physically identical but separated by a river of mercury. Okay, it requires a bit of poetic licence, as the split points must be arbitrary and the very act of existing in each one is evidence of them witnessing some kind of passing of time. But the concept of being able to time travel through the lives of the residents of this world simply by walking to different points in their lives is brilliant. It also makes it possible to have Ace's journey intersect with the Chronauts' lives in a non-linear way without her needing anything to get around other than a bike. We get to see this bike discarded by the Doctor shortly after it's found in a much more aged condition by Ace. The guards enslaving the Gallifreyans turn out to be versions of themselves from the ends of their own lives. Never really explained how they become strange insect-headed mutants, but that's just what happens. Oh yeah, and the cat makes a few brief appearances in the city throughout the story. It's hard to work out at this point just how important it is, but it clearly has a role to play. And what of the actual story? Well, it'll probably come as little surprise to learn that the world they're inside is in fact the TARDIS, turned inside out as a result of crashing with another ship inside the vortex. Perhaps the relatively unsophisticated nature of the timescape prevented it from having a time ram effect that obliterated them both. Perhaps Platt just chose to ignore that bit of continuity. Dr. Wilby refers to it as a sardit, space and relative dimension in time, as if that means something, and it's described as time, space and 35 other dimensions tangled like a cat's cradle, warped by the processes, turned inside out and potentially inescapable. Dr. Wilby gradually regains his memories to become the Doctor again, and is revealed to be able, in times of great emergency, to manipulate relative dimensions like imagination and inner space-time. But all said and done, the stuff that happens in the city is set dressing, and it's still ancient Gallifrey, the Pythia, Rassilon and Vale who hold the real interest here. We do get a hint of this direction of story in the city, with the Doctor first encountering a young Shanzi. He acknowledges that most Time Lords would be uncomfortable around children, would find them unnatural due to the lack of them, small ones anyway, on Gallifrey. Because this is, of course, the book that introduces the idea of looms and Gallifreyan sterility. Ace gets glimpses of the Doctor's memories spent on Lungbarrow Mountain with his 45 cousins, fully grown babies born from the family loom. The war of science and superstition is, of course, won by science. How could it not be? And yet this is clearly a world in which magic plays some part, or at least what could pass for magic. During the occasional glimpses we get throughout the book's main section, we see the Pythia, the female head of Gallifreyan society, hidden away in a cavern, afraid she is losing her powers. Rassilon patiently playing political games, the pair waiting for the return of the timescape. The 90 minutes relative time it takes for the journey passes into hours and days. She recalls a legendary Gallifreyan creature, the Amphis Baner, a serpent with a head at each end. This is somehow manifested as a data vor and is known as the process, although that's never really explained. The Doctor refers to a previously unspecified law prohibiting Time Lords to travel into Gallifreyan history. The climax of the narrative is underwhelming. The Pythia uses a telepathic connection with Vale to talk to the Doctor, who tells her she is the last of the Pythias. She rages in response and the city collapses in on itself, everybody escaping at the last second. It's particularly underwhelming because we never really properly work out what the processes are and what their plan is. The old process wants to ensure a new process is born from the moon in the sky, actually just an egg, and thankfully that's the last time we'll see that awful trope in Doctor Who. Just before everything is crushed into nothing and the Sardit finally becomes a TARDIS again. But at no point is it satisfyingly explained what this is actually about. There's no clever escape plan, no exciting twist. The Doctor manages to reset the internal configuration using a computer terminal. Ace fancies Shonzi, but he can't come with them. The Chronauts all leave. The only really interesting thing happens, of course, on ancient Gallifrey. Her position of power lost, her successor, Vale, dead, the timescape returning, signalling the new era of scientific enlightenment and time travel. The Pythia and her sisters depart Gallifrey for Khan, becoming the Sisterhood of Khan of Brain of Morbius and Night of the Doctor fame in the process. Her last gift to Gallifrey is a curse, the final appearance of magic at the end of this fantastical era. She curses the Gallifreyans with sterility. Never again will anyone from the planet be able to conceive a child. This is slightly contradicted in a couple of later books, but generally is the VNA line on Gallifreyan history. Rassilon becomes ruler of Gallifrey, a mysterious, unnamed other character of power observes, and the first of many stillborn children is birthed. The old times are over. Upon his return to Gallifrey, Captain Peccary is sent to Omega to relay the snippets of information he'd learned from the Doctor and his TARDIS. We get a hint of the scientific advances of the coming years. Families born through genetic looms, their bodies woven into reality, the advent of regeneration, the advance in time travel technology. But this is a story we'll pick up many years from now in Marc Platt's next book. And for now, the Cartmel master plan takes a backseat once again. A little bit of fun appears in all the Gallifreyan lore, in the form of Pridonius being invited to act as an observer in a minor territorial dispute between Ruta III and Sontara Warburg. Not the name the Sontaran homeworld will go on to take in the future, but given that this is ancient history, back countless millennia, maybe millions of years, it's amusing to see how long they and the Rutans have been fighting. Cat's Cradle Time's Crucible is a book heavy in lore and deep exploration of ideas barely touched previously on screen, and a story in which the Doctor is lost inside a violent alien version of somewhere very familiar, leaving Ace to find him. The difference between this and Time Worm Revelation, the previous entry in the series, and one which could be described in exactly those same terms, is nevertheless enormous. Whereas Revelation is a dynamic, vibrant book overflowing with ideas and brave concepts, Time's Crucible is slow and stodgy. The Gallifreyan lore is actually brilliant if you like that kind of thing, and the city is a wonderfully drawn, thoroughly alien place with the process a creature of true revulsion. But much like the city itself, time doesn't seem to move. Things feel stale, unchanging, turgid. The grey, lifeless sterility and endless trudge of life in the city permeates the prose, and while it's tempting to think of that as a deliberate decision, it's difficult to actually believe. In the hands of a more experienced writer and a much more disciplined editor, this could have been a genuine classic. Instead, it's a huge splodge of fascinating ideas, but ultimately a really missed potential. Time's Crucible ends on a cliffhanger of sorts. The Doctor has work to do and is sending Ace somewhere that has Persian carpets. The Silver Cat watches from beneath a mound of bric-a-brac. But more on all that next time. Favourite quotes? There are some good ones here. When Platt really puts his mind to it, he can come up with an excellent turn of phrase. All this world was a great city where time flowed strangely and was fed by many tributaries. It is the terrible world of future legends where people meet their memories and the full of their lives is spread before them. In this place our thoughts were turned in on themselves and were no longer shared. Each one's thoughts were his alone, and we despaired. Chapter 10 is called Daleks Don't Like Finger Biscuits. "Tell me, wise one," Pythia cried. She pressed her hands against the glass of the exhibit. "If they doom me, they doom the world. What is the future? Tell me!" Rassilon fell forward with a cry of pain. His toe had been stubbed on a shelf. And a nursery rhyme, or a mid-Gallifreyan nursery versary. "Isn't it dark? Isn't it cold? Seek out the future before you get old. Once there were children, this is their doom. Now all the people are born from the loom." A bold opening then to the V&A's second series, and published at the point the BBC wrote to Virgin to say there would be no new episodes incoming. The Virgin New Adventures were now the official continuation of Doctor Who for the foreseeable future. And so Doctor Who was heading off into strange experimental new times. The second book in the Cat's Cradle series, Warhead, would follow soon after and explore even more unexpected themes. But more on that in the next video. And that's it for this time. Do leave me a comment down below. I'd love to know what your thoughts on this book are. And do give me a like, a subscribe, maybe share the video, anything like that. That will really help the channel. And I hope you join me very soon for Cat's Cradle Warhead.